Hi, I'm Gavin, and this is my first time talking at NI DevConf, so thanks for taking the time to join my talk on continuous application security. First, I'll give a bit of background into myself, and that will give an idea of why I'm talking about this today. I'm a full-stack developer at Contrast, and I joined the growing Belfast team in August. We're a company that specialises in continuous application security, and all of my post-uni experience so far has been in application security. But my career hasn't been a particularly long one, so I'm not sure how much an achievement that is really. My first job was a partnership between Queen's University and a London company that was then called Intelligent Environments. And there I was focused on implementing RASP, runtime application self-protection, within their platform, which they sold on to banks and other financial companies. And my last job was at Uleska, a Belfast startup where I joined the team as first full-time developer. And there I was focused on automated security tools, which give me an understanding of the current state of AppSec and the use of SAST DAST tools. And for any avoidance of doubt, that's me on the right and Jock on the left. So, before jumping into continuous application security and what it is, I will try to set the stage for what the AppSec landscape looks like today, with an overview on what the average applications look like, as well as the attack landscape that threatens them. We'll go into a brief look at what we want from application security, from which we can assess the effectiveness of the different types of security tools. Then we will talk about the current state of application security and the tools which dominate it, which are static and dynamic application security testing. And then finally, we can look at the main part of the talk, continuous application security and how it's provided by IAST, interactive application security testing, and RASP, runtime application self-protection. So, what does the average application look like? The average application is vulnerable, and let's say that this iceberg represents the average application, whether it be a single monolith or an overall view of microservices supporting an application. So the section below the water is the code that's in there, but you didn't write yourself, and maybe you don't have a great idea of its inner workings. So these are the third-party libraries and frameworks that are loaded in through NPM, Maven, and so on. Above the water is the custom code, business logic, and anything that you, your team, or company has written. You can expect to have vulnerabilities in both your custom code and the libraries or frameworks you have brought in. Say we have two vulnerabilities in the bottom part. These are the libraries and frameworks. These two vulnerabilities could be known vulnerabilities with CVEs, and you could possibly expect even more if you aren't keeping on top of library updates and miss out on things like security patches. Now on the top part, parts that a team or company writes themselves. On average, there could be 27 vulnerabilities, which would show some serious issues. As a whole, this might look like a scarily large amount of code to wade through to remediate issues, but what a lot of people forget is that you don't actually need to worry about unreachable code if it is never going to be called. At least immediately. You might want to get to it later, but it's not a priority. So you can prioritize your efforts on the code you actually use, the bit at the top, and the third-party code you actually make use of. This might not sound like a huge deal, but if you've dealt with some of the existing security tools out there, then you'll know how long they can run for, how much results they return, how many of them are false positives, and then because of that, how much time you could save if you know which ones you can actually focus on. Okay, so we know what our applications look like, but vulnerabilities mean nothing without knowing if they will ever be exploited. So what does the attack landscape look like today? And these numbers come from data that we gathered from customers' live production applications. For each application, we've seen an average of 13,279 attacks every single month. And for those applications, 65% were hit with SQL injection attacks, 62% with broken access control attacks, 64% with cross-site scripting, and you can see the full report at the bottom and you can see the figures that are here. You might recognize most of these from the OWASP top 10. This shows that attackers are constantly barraging applications with attacks, and that if you have any sort of visibility on your application, so a good number of users, you can expect to hit with some of these. So security should be a big consideration during development. In order to be able to measure the effectiveness of the AppSec tools we use, we need to first define what it is that we want. The weighting of these different measurements may be affected by multiple factors such as the criticality of an application, how quickly changes are rolled out, and so on. But let's think about the average web application where we have multiple developers working on it, a full CI/CD pipeline, mature unit and integration testing with relatively high coverage, and frequent rollouts, whether they be daily or maybe even weekly. So, as a developer, I know that some of these requirements may sound basic, but having used some of the most well-known commercial tools on the market, it would surprise you how many fail to achieve these. From a company standpoint, you want to empower developers to deal with security issues themselves, rather than having to rely on expensive and hard-to-hire security professionals. The way that we can do this is by making security easy to do and integrating it with how developers work already. Allowing at least basic testing during development means that it doesn't take 6 months on a pen test or a security review for a dev to learn that they have introduced a vulnerability. By that point, you'd be lucky if the developer even remembers writing that line or class, never mind expecting to learn from it. We also want to speed up the feedback loop where possible. Where we do find vulnerabilities, whether it be in development or during a later stage, the faster the developer is notified, the better, as the less costly it is to correct and the risk of the vulnerability being repeated between the first instance and the test is decreased. And ultimately, you don't want to slow your devs down. After the developer pushes up their code, it's important that we ensure a certain level of quality before we allow it to be shipped to production. Not only do we need to do this, but we also need to do it in a way that doesn't add overhead to the integration, as this is one of the biggest barriers to quickly pushing code out, and it can lead to steps being skipped or not implemented in the first place. The best way to do this is integrating with existing testing. You don't only add to the workload of your developers or ops teams by having them learn and implement a new and familiar testing framework, or have the barrier of separate results, which can lead to things being missed. You don't want to slow down existing builds. It's not unusual for teams today to expect to deal with nightly or weekly tests, but this is one of the biggest blockers to companies being able to push out changes quickly and leads to DevOps pipelines feeling half-baked. And just like other tests, if there is a real bug, in this case a real vulnerability, you want to break the build to stop that getting out there. But the emphasis here is on real vulnerabilities, which can be hard to differentiate from false positives. Then, in production, too often teams simply hope that their application is secure when it gets to this stage. This isn't enough to stop attacks. We need a concrete way to automatically stop attacks without relying on devs to work on the almost impossible task of ensuring 100% security in their code at all times. We need to monitor attacks to know who is attacking, what they're attacking, when they're attacking, and how they're attacking. This is something that is most often missed, as teams too often simply hope that all known vulnerabilities have been patched and they don't need to worry about them in production. But even knowing about stopped attacks gives us the threat intelligence that we need to properly prioritize vulnerabilities found during testing and to respond to any attacks going forward. Even if we master the previous requirements, and probably even especially if we do, we don't want to create alert fatigue for our security and dev teams. This is when you see so many alerts, many often false positives or low risk, that teams just begin to lose focus of the vulnerabilities that really matter. So, firstly, let's look at static application security testing. As the name suggests, it runs on static files, whether it be source code or compiled binaries. Because it has access to the code, it can gain knowledge of the language or languages that are used, the libraries and frameworks imported, and how these are implemented and used. It's a form of white box testing. The code is scanned either line by line or using call graphs and checked for possible vulnerabilities. For example, finding buffer overflow vulnerabilities when input length isn't limited correctly, or SQL injection vulnerabilities when database queries aren't parameterized. Since the code itself is scanned, SAST tools are able to report the exact location of a vulnerability, usually telling you the exact line. Dynamic application security testing, it runs on deployed applications, and generally this is done within a QA environment. Since they are run without seeing the internals of the application, they often don't have knowledge of the app internals, at least out of the box. However, this can be configured by somebody with specialist knowledge of the DAST tool and the application under test. It scans an application's web pages or API via web request to it, either using a pre-configured list of addresses or using a technique known as spidering or crawling, which looks for common paths such as /login, or follows any links found on web pages, for example, from the navigation bar. In order to find vulnerabilities, these requests can also often be mutative and malicious. For example, in order to find a SQL injection vulnerability, a payload with the injection must be sent and the response must indicate that it was successful. And once a vulnerability is confirmed, the result can be reported with the request information, such as the URI it was sent to, any path parameters sent, the request body, and so on. So, looking back to what we wanted from AppSec tools, how do SAST and DAST, the most common type of tool, measure up? For this, I'll be assuming that both SAST and DAST are implemented together, but often one is implemented without the other, and that's if either are implemented at all. First, looking at how they empower developers, they do a poor job. For some SAST tools, they can provide some testing during development, though this wouldn't give complete coverage. In terms of a quick feedback loop, SAST would struggle to give a complete picture of the application locally, so a scan is usually done during integration and not the empower developers during development. DAST requires a deployed application, so generally feedback takes some time. Devs can be slowed down by the sheer number of false positives that are found by SAST. Dealing with each one or trying to gain the knowledge of what a specific vulnerability even is can take time that you prefer developers to be spending on real bugs, or better yet, features. In terms of ensuring quality, the picture is much the same. Both SAST and DAST tools generally require their own run, not integrating well with existing testing, and they require their own setup and execution. DAST especially requires a lot of configuration to run, since it has no knowledge of the app internals out of the box. The tools need to be extensively configured, otherwise we'll have to check every endpoint for every type of vulnerability. An example, going back to SQL injection attack, without configuration, a scan could run for hours to discover this alone, even with just a few endpoints, if it wasn't told what kind of database to expect. Both SAST and DAST will add additional time to any build, given that they don't integrate with existing testing, and given that they can take a long time to run, it might not be feasible for them to run during each testing phase, meaning that releases could be blocked until a scheduled scan takes place. One thing they will do, which should be expected of any type of test, is allow the build to be broken on issues being found. Though this is good, it may be an issue, especially for SAST, as the rate of false positives is so high, breaking the build on issues may not be desired, and this is likely to be disabled. So the high rate of false positives could lead to true positives being missed. So it might be slightly unfair of me to include production at all in this, since SAST and DAST aren't really made to cover applications running in production. In this case, something like a WAF or web application firewall could be implemented. But an approach that is too common is to deal with security vulnerabilities found during the testing phases with SAST and DAST and rely on them being remediated before an app gets to production. Coverage of production is something that's missing in a lot of applications today. Overall, I think that the current approach to AppSec doesn't get some of the basic requirements right. This can make security seem like one of those tedious tasks that requires a highly skilled security professional to make workable, and something that developers just dread having to deal with. And I think it's obvious that we need something better. So let's look at continuous application security. As the name suggests, continuous application security means that security is baked into the whole process of the SDLC, from development right up to production. This contrasts with the most common approach to security, which I've just went over, which is to run SAST or DAST scans periodically, or have a pen test every few months. The coverage is provided by interactive application security testing and runtime application self-protection. So what is interactive application security testing? As the name suggests, it involves interacting with an application, whether that be through a human tester, integration tests, or any other form of using the application. It could even be through a DAST scanner, though this wouldn't be necessary. Onboarding an application for IAST typically involves running the application using an agent. Agents are often used for things such as profiling an application. They can take in an application, in the case of Java's jar file, and add code to it without having to manually edit the source code. This is useful for wanting to automate code generation for things like monitoring, or in our case, security scanning. Because the IAST agent has access to the code, it comes with all of the knowledge that you would expect SAST to have, including the language, libraries, frameworks, and the implementation of these. It's another form of white box testing. It checks for vulnerabilities during interactions with the application. This could be through automated tests. The reports IAST provides will include both the code location and the request sent to discover it, so it essentially gives a union of the results you could expect from running both SAST and DAST scans. Runtime application self-protection is very similar to IAST, however it runs in production. It's easier to simply highlight the few differences. It also runs as an agent, but in production. Rather than reporting on vulnerabilities, it actively blocks the exploit of them. Remember that this will be from real users and possibly malicious attackers. It gives us visibility into active threats by reporting the code location and the request of real attacks. And this is a phrase I think I've coined myself, white box reporting. And what I mean by this is, if an application was protected by a web application firewall or a WAF, it may block some of these exploits, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as useful to a developer as it wouldn't give them the exact code location of where the vulnerability appears. So just to look at how they work together, we have our developer or automated tests on the top and a malicious attacker on the bottom. You can see he's malicious because of Sudi and his literal black hat. I'm not sure why he needs both, but it's his life. We have our application running with our agent and all of the sensors it has onboarded. When either of our actors interact with the application, the agent will track the data as it gets passed throughout the application. Say we have two interactions, one for each actor, and both result in a SQL query. We will track the data passed via the request and watch it as it progresses through the application, which each point may be representing a class or a function call. When the agent realizes the query is about to be executed, it will look through the calls that have preceded it and check, has this data been parameterized? Has it been escaped? And pretty much, has anything been done to prevent the SQL injection attack? In the case of IAST, we can use even benign input this way to confirm a vulnerability. Even if the input is what we expect, we can look through the code to see if there's no parameterization or escaping and so on. We know that this could as easily have been a successful SQL injection attack. The difference in RASP is that we will also analyze the code input to see, does this input change the behavior of the query to be executed? And if so, then it will actively block the query from being run and stop it being executed. Okay, so let's get to the demo. For this, I'll be using a modified vulnerable version of Spring Pet Clinic, which is just an open source demo application for Java Spring. And I'll also be using Contrast, Assess, and Protect, which are IAST and RASP respectively. And there are other products out there, but obviously this is the one I'm most familiar with and probably a bit biased towards. So let's get started. Here we can see the Contrast dashboard. So I have a couple of applications in here that are vulnerable that I've previously used, but the one that I'm actually going to demo today hasn't been on board yet. So I'll show you how easy that is. So here we can see the Spring Pet Clinic, and this is just the README that's provided on the open source one. But if I just jump across into the POM, here we can see some of the arguments that I'm passing in whenever the Spring Boot application actually runs. So I'm giving it the IAST agent here, and I'm also passing in some config like development environment, and also giving it the server name of dev193. If I go ahead and start this up, it should start up with the agent. So simply by going to visit it in the browser, it should register on the dashboard, which we'll see in a minute. Okay, so it's just about started. If I jump across and visit it in the browser, just by loading this, it will have registered with the agent will have spoke to the server, and we should see something when we refresh here. Here we are. So we already have 3 vulnerabilities, and I'll not delve into these, but that's just from registering this simple homepage. And if I were to use this like a normal user, so this application is really made for pairing up owners of pets with their pets, where then they can register to CVETs and things like that. So as you've seen in my intro, I do have a dog which I can register. And this is all we really need to do is interact with it like a normal user. So no specialist knowledge needed and no real training. So fortunately Jock isn't covered under any data protection, so I'll just go ahead and add his real date of birth. And if I've added him, then I should be able to go and also do a search, find myself, and I also see him. So we've interacted with it there. We've used a few different forms and a few different places where an attacker could look to do an attack. So if we jump back into our dashboard and just refresh it, we should see some new vulnerabilities here. Okay, so we have 9, and I could look in and drill into them here, but I'm a developer and it's not really where I want to do it. I would prefer to do it in my IDE, somewhere where it actually can tell me. So I'll just go ahead and refresh that to make sure it's up to date. So I want to do it in here so that I know exactly where to patch. It can give me all the information it needs and like directly to it. So I have the same vulnerabilities. Here's a critical one on injection, and then I also have a few high and mediums. But if I drill into this one, I can see a basic overview. As I said, we get both the request and also the code information here. So here you can see the endpoint it was sent to. I can jump across and see the full request that was sent. I can also see the exact line that has the vulnerability on it. And I can even see the query that was actually generated. So theoretically, this could have been a SQL injection in here. It gives me some information on how to fix it. I can even go in and look at the events to get a stack trace of what happened. And then I can even click on the stack trace on any of these lines. And here I can see the exact query, the exact line that the query is generated on. So this is where I need to patch. Okay, so we know where to patch, but there's also some other features we can use. So we can tag different vulnerabilities to kind of group them together. And we can also even mark some of them as, like, say, remediated or some of these other statuses in here, and that'll be reflected in our dashboard. Or if we would prefer to delve into the details in the dashboard, we can also link straight back. So that shows how much easier it is to deal with those vulnerabilities during development. So how about QA, which we can see here is empty. If we jump straight back across into IntelliJ, similarly to how we just ran that, we can see some of the test configuration. So I'll just start this in the meantime. There we are, so we can start as tests. So pretty much all this is doing, this Maven Surefire plugin, if you're not familiar with it, this is just going to run this using the Java agent as part of the normal test. So you could just imagine that this is going to be running within Jenkins or GitHub Actions or some other integration environment, rather than just straight through the IDE. So once this finishes off, we should be able to see that QA environment populated, and we'll have the same sort of coverage as our integration tests are given here. So even if I just kind of do it during the middle of the tests, we can see here that the QA environment has now appeared with a number of vulnerabilities, and it's actually less than is in the development, and that's partially because they've done it halfway through. But it also could be impacted by the code coverage, as I said. But one of the interesting things about IAST is that because it integrates with your current test, if you have, say, 100% coverage, then you could say that 100% of your application is actually being ran with the IAST scanner. Alright, so finally let's go into production. So you can see here that it's not defined, and the reason that it isn't defined is that it hasn't been interacted since I actually onboarded this application, but it is up and running. And if we go to petclinic.com, which I've forwarded to the production environment, here we can see it. So if we jump back, then we should see our production environment. And there we are. So we can also note that protect is actually turned on for this. And before it actually really intercepts some of the attacks, we just need to do some basic configuration. So if I go in here, I can tell it exactly what I want to block. So in production, I want to block SQL injection attacks. and I can jump straight back into the overview. And if I go back to the dev environment, so this is run on localhost, then I can actually go to find owners, and I can do a SQL injection attack by doing this. And what this does is it'll pretty much just evaluate the tree for any row. So you can see that that's succeeded. So rather than actually take that as a string, it's taken it as part of the query. And that proves that the vulnerability is there. If I go ahead and do the same thing in here, so we actually get an error, and it says that the SQL injection has been detected. So it successfully blocked that attack. And if I come straight back into the dashboard and refresh, and then this will actually give me some of the information on the attack. So if I click in here, I can see the source IP. Obviously it's just my local IP, but that could be a real attacker's. And we can also take some basic actions such as blacklisting, adding a virtual patch, and more actions could be added later to this. So there's quite a lot in here. We've covered pretty much the whole SDLC there. So I've seen some pretty good stuff, and I mean, you've seen how easy that was. So if we just kind of go back and we can recap what we've learned. And if we look back to what we want to get from AppSec tools, through the use of the agent, they can be run anywhere, and the additional support through the IDE plugin, we can easily test code during development. There's a quick or pretty much instantaneous feedback loop, as vulnerabilities are recorded and displayed in real time, as they are encountered during interactions with the app. And devs aren't slowed down. If anything, resolving security issues has been sped up significantly, as they can be found during development rather than having to wait on a SAST or DAST scan during integration, which then goes to Jira without enough information to remediate. In terms of ensuring quality, all we need to do is add the agent to our test runs, and our existing tests will have the additional security checks. So there's pretty much seamless integration with existing tests, and the coverage from your integration test, if it's at 100%, then you should see a great deal of coverage on security testing as well. Since it runs as part of the existing testing, there isn't any additional overhead, and our builds don't take any longer than they would without the agent. Given the extra context that the IAST agent has, because it's able to run within the application, there's less false positives. So we can ensure that we only break the build when we need to, and not for thousands of false positives from SAST that's generated from code that maybe isn't even used. In production, after we run with the agent, we automatically get a great deal of protection. We can stop the same attacks we were detecting without having to patch vulnerabilities, though I'm not saying that it isn't advised. We can monitor attacks in real time. We can get information on who, what, where, when, and how. We can also connect this up to monitoring solutions, maybe in Slack, PagerDuty, or pretty much any other supported integration. And because RASP has the context from inside the application that IAST also would, we can still say with a great deal of confidence whether or not this attack was actually an attack, and that can vastly reduce the number of false positives that can lead to alert fatigue. So, continuous application empowers developers to deal with security themselves. It easily integrates with QA to provide security coverage, and it provides protection in production. To recap, the current approach to AppSec through SAST DAST is really outdated, and I think that continuous application security is needed to bring AppSec into the DevSecOps era. SAST and DAST simply aren't suited to continuous delivery pipelines. They're too often slow and blocking. I'm going to stop using them. Personally, I think that IASP is a firm stand-in for anything that SAST or DAST can do, provided the language and framework that you use are supported by an IAST agent. And RASP gives you something neither of them can, even if they were used in unison with a web application firewall. I think that there may be a case for continuous application security in unison with maybe SAST to ensure total coverage, but in the case of it being one or the other, I think that continuous application security clearly comes out in front, and it definitely will be the future of application security. So, thanks again for taking the time to listen to my talk today. I hope it was educational in some way, and if you'd like to join me at Contrast, there's plenty of jobs going. I haven't been part of the team for very long, but it's all been great so far. And you can feel free to reach out to me at any point, whether it's about this talk or anything else. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.